Right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who've been here, thank you for staying the course. For those of you who haven't been here earlier, welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Dan Schiller. I met Dan first many years ago in 1999 when we both wound up at a meeting of an organization called the Internet Political Economy Forum. And in those days, I was a techno-utopian. And Dan was it was a meeting of broadly speaking techno-utopians. Other people there were John Perry Barlow, Vint Cerf, Craig Mundy, and a number of others who had drunk the technological Kool-Aid. And Dan was a disturbing figure for me because he was the first non-technological utopian I'd ever met. And because he was locating the development of the internet in what seemed to us to be an extremely sordid background, namely that of the telecommunications business. But over the years, I'm now a recovering utopian, and I've seen the error of my ways and more appreciated Dan's perspective the longer I've gone on. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Dan. Thank you for coming. In terms of his biography, he's Professor Emeritus of Library and Information Science and of Communications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's a historian of information communication technologies in the context of 500-year development of the capitalist economy, so it's good to have him here. He's had chairs at UCSD, UCLA and Temple Universities, and is the author of several books, including one with the title Digital Capitalism, and the new book is called Digital Depression. He writes about the internet and other communications technologies for Monde Diplomatique, and he's presently doing archival research for a long-standing project of his on the history of US telecommunications. And he's also an academic visitor at our research project on technology and democracy. Dan, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm assured that I'm going to be picked up on this microphone even if I don't hunch. But the temptation is great because, as I know some of you will know from experience, when you're tall, you hunch. So if I start to hunch, just correct me. Don't correct me about anything intellectual, though. No, of course not. John, thank you so much for inviting me, and David for inviting me to this event. The whole day has been exciting and educative for me. And I can only applaud those of you who are willing to take another hour and a half out of your lives to endure still more. But I'll try to be relatively energetic, and the rest is up to you. My theme is digital capitalism, stagnation and contention with a question mark. Great changes are occurring around digital networks. At the same time, abiding political economic processes carry forward. I've developed the concept of digital capitalism for this reason. A phase change is occurring within capitalism. Digital capitalism, one might say, is emerging out of industrial capitalism. Before turning to consider some of the structural problems that confront digital capitalism today, namely contention and stagnation, I'll elaborate on 4 points pertaining to its industrial profile. Unevenly across decades and centuries, the Industrial Revolution gripped not only manufacturing, but also it's important that we remember agriculture, trade, and indeed information. Eileen Fife has characterized 19th century British publishing as, quote, steam-powered knowledge, which is a good way to shorthand that. So today, the importance of digital networks stretches beyond any discrete information sector, and this was a theme that we were talking about some in our discussions earlier. Digital systems and services have been, and I can't resist saying this, bolted to all parts of the political economy. This carries ramifications. One is that it is short-sighted, I think, to equate the digital merely with familiar consumer markets, as for search engines, smartphones, and social networks. And I'm not saying this in order to discount their importance. I'm merely saying it's not correct to equate digitization or digital capitalism only with this sector. Consumer expenditures on digital goods and services account for an estimated 30% of the worldwide total, which one would never imagine from the extent of our surroundedness by them. Nor is it sufficient to try to grasp the digital merely by focusing only on vendors, whether it's IBM and AT&T in the 1970s, and those were the two titans of that time. The French were worried enough about them to commission a report to the president, which basically isolated them as the Scylla and Charybdis of contemporary information provision. Or Microsoft and Intel a decade or two later, or Google and Amazon and Facebook and Apple today. Digital capitalism has been constructed and reconstructed, not only by suppliers, but also by corporate users on the demand side, the likes of Walmart and General Motors and Exxon and Monsanto and JP Morgan Chase. Later, I'll try to suggest that government also has been crucial, and that these business users' importance has not least been political as well as economic. A second point of my four in this first section pertains to the chronology and character of capital investment in what the US Census Bureau now enumerates under the category of information processing, equipment, and software. So that's the name they now give to what had been several more discrete categories that were not connected in an earlier enumeration. US capital investment in networks, of course, began long ago and long before the digital. Private line telegraphs, lines dedicated to traffic sent and received by a single business user who leased them from Western Union on a monthly basis, saw a widening use by big banks, meat packers, and by the Standard Oil Company by the 1880s to the 1910s. Industrial radio services, as they used to be called, proceeded to apply wireless technology to the operations of railroads, power transmission systems, department stores, airplane operating companies, and newspapers. By 1947, at the cusp of the movement to what we would identify as digital, U.S. oil companies had built 500 radio stations and obtained licenses to 49 radio frequencies in their search for oil deposits, which is an interesting set of statistics because that's not really an order of magnitude different than the number of stations or frequencies allocated to the commercial broadcast sector of radio. They began to use microwave radio, the oil companies did, in order to send data produced by the new offshore drilling rigs that they were putting together to geologists and engineers located at their headquarters as far back as the 1950s. And it's arguable that you couldn't have had offshore drilling without that data transmission capability. So I'm trying to build an argument here from the get-go that says digitization is not something that happens now, only in the last few years, but something that's been layered in repeatedly, progressively, successively, in iterations as the previously industrial system began to morph towards something else. The political scientist Murray Edelman, some of you may know of him, and the economist Dallas Smythe sought to place these neglected analog network services on the academic agenda as far back as the 1950s. And there are books by each of those guys on them. Capital investment in information processing equipment and software, however, undeniably accelerated sharply after the recession of the early 1970s, by which time the applications had been expanding of digital systems for 20 years. In addition to specialized equipment, permitting the national telecommunications network to function as a mechanism for data transfer, Dedicated private circuits and public packet switch networks were commercially available. This is all before the thing we take to be the internet was on stream for most people. Expenditures on high tech, including computing, accounting, office machines, communication equipment, and instruments, quickly began to surpass other categories to become the largest single category of capital investment in equipment and a key driver of economic growth in their own right. And this has been true now for some decades. They're the largest category of capital spending on equipment. Big business's commitment to data communications took several forms as companies and individual departments were locked in by competing vendors' proprietary strategies. So some of you will remember we had system network architecture from IBM, for example, or we had different services from other computer vendors, and they were incompatible. And no small part of the internet's magic is attributed to its ability to overcome those proprietary systems. James Cortada cites an internal IBM estimate, and he works for IBM, so I think that gives me a little more trust, that ICT investment escalated from 38 to 55% of all equipment spending between 1990, just before the internet took off, and 2001. So it gives you some sense of the significance. Sectoral variation was and remains considerable. Forestry, fishing, and agricultural services account for a small proportion of the total capital investment, but not a negligible one. I mean, we're talking, the most recent statistics in the US context are about 2 years old. And so for 2013, which is the most recent data, it was only released in the spring of 2015, forestry, fishing, and agricultural services took about $153 million in capital investment, which is in absolute terms a fair amount of money, but put that next to what's spent in other sectors and you get a greater kind of accumulating sense of what's involved for the economy as a whole. Professional, scientific, and technical services, $30 billion of investment. Manufacturing, $37 billion. So that's a sector that's widely said to be dead in the United States, and it's not. It's not dead. $37 billion of investment is a considerable amount. The second top category is finance and insurance, with about $60 billion of capital investment each year, which is a prodigious amount. And the largest spender is the information industry itself, which is defined to include everybody from publishers to computer services companies. And its collective outlay is about $86 billion a year. So that gives you, and there are many other categories, but that gives you a loose sense of the spending in this area. My third point is that digital networks did not free capitalism from its crisis tendencies, but became embedded in them in fairly complicated ways. By the early 2000s, financial intermediaries, and we heard a great deal of very illuminating discussion about them this morning, had been spearheading the development of digital systems, and this afternoon, had been spearheading the development of digital systems for decades. The largest US financial companies spend billions of dollars a year individually on ICTs and boast IT and software staffs numbering upwards of 5,000 people. I mean, JP Morgan Chase has, I think, 8,000 people in that category. It's an enormous number of people. It's much more. I mean, it's a greater number than you'd see in companies that are supposedly information companies or media companies. It's a very large number. The titanic buildup of networked finance grew over the last several decades as banks pushed debt on every institution and packaged it in a staggering variety of instruments. Banks institutionalized fee-based products, own account trades, and off-the-books investment vehicles, even as they continually increased their own leverage. And of course, I'm only speaking here of US banks. I know this would never happen here. But they continually increased their own leverage, which means their risk. This opaque, complex, and as it turned out, rickety system crashed when some US residential mortgage holders ceased to make payments, which nobody imagined could crash or come close to the global financial system. Leverage, or debt, was the fuel that stoked this fire. And networked finance had spread that leverage everywhere. So it's a complex causal chain that I'm trying to invoke. I mean, it's not the digitization separate from the leverage. It's that the digitization animates the leverage under contemporary circumstances. In the aftermath of the crisis, again, from a US perspective, network finance has carried forward. It has not ceased. And so some people worry about that. The networks were bearers of crisis, or excuse me, that networks were bearers of crisis again became apparent as the crisis cascaded into the wider economy, because as you know, it didn't contain itself to the financial world. It moved beyond it. Manufacturers had deployed digital networks to automate and to outsource production and to disperse their operations in order to improve market access and or to cheapen the cost of labor. This great buildup of manufacturing networks again occurred over decades. And it's important to recognize that it provided no guarantee of corporate profitability in any given case. GM spent tens of billions of dollars on networks over a period of time. Between 1979 and 1983 or 4 alone, it spent an estimated $30 billion on ICTs. It's a colossal amount of money. But that didn't prevent the biggest US automaker from having to be rescued by the US government in the financial and economic crisis that began to unravel things in 2007, 2008. The underlying problem was that manufacturers' networks had been folded into a sweeping crisis tendency, as I see it, as international competition had engendered growing overcapacity in the auto industry, as it had done in many other fields as well. More plants and factories were being built than were needed to supply the global market, at least in ways that were profitable to the suppliers. So the reorganization of manufacturing production contributed to what David Harvey has called wage repression through working class communities in the wealthy countries, as automakers responded to competition by cutting high-wage union employees, which you'd expect. I mean, it's exactly what you'd expect if they were politically enabled to do so, which is what was new in that period. Reciprocal hits to demand were predictable. The average age of vehicles on the road in the United States hit an all-time high this year. This has been attributed, naturally, to quality improvements. People are hanging onto their cars longer because they're better. Now, I'm not to say that they may not be better in some respects, but it seems fairly certain to me that hard times have been a decisive factor as well. By 2015, both new and used car owners in the United States were holding onto their vehicles for 2 full years longer than what had been the average in 2006. It's hard to imagine that's attributable only to quality improvements over a period of 7 years. Although I have to say, I just bought a new car, and the only thing that the salesperson wanted to tell me about was the electronics. I mean, there was no kicking of tires, there was no discussion of the engine, there was nothing of anything except, let me show the electronics. And before I knew it, he had basically downloaded my iPhone onto the car. And so I said, well, what's the system? And he says, it's the car. You know, it's the car that's doing it. So, I mean, we don't really need to have just, you know, a software-enabled car, driverless cars. We're already there in sense that much of a car is software structured. And this is the selling point already. So I was bitter from that experience, and I'm letting you know about it. It should be noted that, once again, the underlying syndrome or problem of overcapacity has not abated. The big car makers, as part of their efforts to salvage themselves, all stampeded into China over the period of the last 15 years or so through joint ventures. And they've come to depend, on average, on Chinese buyers for around 1/3 of their global sales. the big global car makers. That's a lot, a third, over a pretty short period of time. As China's economy has slowed during just this last year, the automakers there have turned to reduce capacity for the first time at the dozens of joint venture plants that they operate. That's a good indication of the thing I'm trying to tell you, that the problem of overcapacity in which the networks are embedded is the culprit. One fourth and final point. For decades, beginning well before the internet's take-up, political leaders recognized that the US information industry was a spectacular pole of growth within the capitalist world economy. Heads of state notably made a point of paying homage to the then reigning US corporate tech titans. Deng Xiaoping came over to Seattle in 1979, Jiang Zemin in 1973, Hu Jintao in 2006. All of them made a point of visiting with tech companies. France, just to show that it's broader, France's Jacques Chirac, you'll remember, President Chirac, he led an entourage to Silicon Valley in 1996. And nearly 20 years later, meaning just this last few months, Brazil's Dilma Rousseff and just last couple of days, India's Narendra Modi have followed suit. In most cases, they want to know, how has the US worked its digital magic? Can it be replicated? Failing that, as the McKinsey consultancy put it only last week in an message that they send out to a really select group of millions that I happen to be in, and I can't seem to do anything about it. But they put this in a message last week, quote, "How should you tap into Silicon Valley?" And that's sort of a shorthand way of saying into the internet tech that the US industry continues to dominate globally. These questions have garnered high-level government attention. And for this reason, I'm now going to consider digital capitalism's political dimension somewhat more explicitly. In 2010, overall US expenditures on ICTs exceeded those of China, Japan, the UK, and Russia combined. The US accounted for more than half of global ICT research and development spending. The payoff was huge. A report to the Council on Foreign Relations underlined in 2013 that, quote, "The US captures more than 30% of global internet revenues and more than 40% of net income. US companies have claimed and kept a commanding lead over nearly all global internet markets." And one that, I can't but mention, wish I could walk away from this, but I can't walk away. We can hear you. No, you can hear me, but, oh, okay, yeah, so I guess it's this that's doing it. So I can walk away, but what was my point? The question is that the smartphone, yes, the smartphone. I mean, you have to remember that it was not that long ago that Nokia was the big game for mobile phones, right? And now the US has blown it away, or Apple has blown it away. Now, I'm not going to make the argument that Apple is thoroughly unassailable. It's more sort of helpful to think of it in terms of it being a constant need of demonstration effect for Apple to see each quarter that it has done what it did before. But on the evidence so far on the 6S, and we don't even need to say what we're talking about, because everybody knows, it looks like the signs are promising. Tim Cook can be pleased. So my point is that US companies have kept a lead over time, now going on some decades, and that political mobilization has been essential in this success, or if you prefer, this lopsided disparity. Much of the world would see it that way. By the mid-60s, and forgive me, I'm a telecommunications historian, so this stuff is the stuff that excites me. I'll start talking about the 1960s if I see you glazing over I will try to modify my position, but my first line of activity is to see if I can bring it off. By the mid-1960s, business users of networks had been lobbying an obscure US agency, the Federal Communications Commission, for years to obtain specialized networking equipment and services. Convened by the Democratic administration of US President Lyndon Johnson in 1967, a high-level task force on communications was formed to evaluate the significant changes that were already roiling the technology of telecommunications and business demand for network systems. Ought policies to be liberalized? Should market entry be opened within the emerging zones of data network functionality? How might growth be stimulated in what was already a field of hot stocks in the 60s? Could liberalization be folded in to LBJ's Great Society projects? Research at archives and special collections reveals that the task force's deliberations engendered intense conflict. While business users pressed for market openings, AT&T did everything in its power to resist such an outcome. Meanwhile, against the backdrop of the Vietnam War and of President Johnson's unexpected decision in March of 1968 not to run for re-election, the proceeding drew covert interventions from a presidential confidant who was also a leading Washington political wire puller. And in this instance, although I don't have a smoking gun, I am certain that he was representing AT&T. By the spring of 1968, the president had lost the ability and perhaps the will to try to set telecommunications liberalization within the wider context of his cherished Great Society programs. Its work stymied, Task Force Chairman, Undersecretary of State Eugene Rostow implored LBJ during the final weeks of his administration not to disband the group or to squelch its revisionary policy findings, which called for limited liberalization of network markets in data communications and some other related areas. The president complied, not without some anguish, and handed off the task force's final report to his successor, unpublished and without comment. After months of deliberation midway through 1969, the incoming Nixon administration reached decisions about networking policy that were as momentous, in my view, as Nixon's nearly concurrent decision to pursue rapprochement with China. And Nixon is, in this way, in my sense of it, the critical US figure for the second half of the 20th century, as Bob Dole eulogized him after his death at his service. And I mean, I detest Richard Nixon, but to give him credit for what he accomplished here needs to be done. Breaking with ingrained Republican habits of deference to existing units of capital. I mean, up until this time, the Republican sort of knee-jerk position with respect to things like this was, well, if AT&T wants it, we should do it. Or if any big unit of enterprise wanted it, we should try to defer. Breaking with that, the Nixon group in its executive branch began to rip out the public service moorings that had constrained AT&T since World War I. Beginning at the edges of the existing system with satellites and cable television, high officials in the Nixon White House coordinated the politics of a systematic liberalization campaign with Nixon's FCC chairman, the powerful right-winger Dean Birch. And it's interesting, Dean Birch was the vice chairman of the Republican Party and a Goldwaterite in the 1964 presidential contest. Dean Birch was a high-level guy, and to put someone like that at the FCC is itself a significant act, because the FCC is basically staffed not by such people, but by lower-level people. It's a relatively small agency, and it hasn't been given, some would say, since the formation of the agency in the 1930s, the resources that it has needed to do an effective job with the brief that it has been handed. So they stripped the liberalization campaign of any social welfare features. And this, I'm trying to argue, was a watershed. I'm not saying that Johnson would have succeeded. That's not possible to say. He never did it. But there was at least some effort to push it in that direction. An antitrust case against AT&T was prepared during the Nixon years, brought to court by the U.S. Justice Department under his successor, Gerald Ford, and settled by the breakup of the world's largest company under Republican Ronald Reagan. I'm not suggesting that liberalization should be credited to Republicans. I mean, it originated with Democrats. It then was carried forward by Republicans. I'm only trying to point out that they did participate actively, and they helped to redefine somewhat its social flavor. Backed by a burgeoning lobby of business user trade groups and independent suppliers and would-be suppliers of specialized equipment, the liberalization trend must be accorded a bipartisan political cast. It's been engaged in, I mean, you know Al Gore was the father of the internet, right? So there is Democrats as well as Republicans in it. And there have been conflicts throughout. I'm not trying to wash those away, but I'm saying that in its essentials, it's been bipartisan. To reduce a complicated and technical process to its essentials, business users of networks and independent, meaning non-AT&T suppliers of equipment and services were granted expansive freedom to pursue specialized networking initiatives as a proprietary matter. Pyramiding increases in capital investment in information processing equipment and software were predicated on this radical policy shift. And it's not an accident that the dates work pretty well. It's not only because of the recession of the early mid-70s, but also the liberalization trend that became decisively accelerated at that time that we see this. On the other hand, it needs to be at least mentioned that mostly unionized telecommunications workers came into the crosshairs of the market opening trend, and their numbers began to drop, and they've dropped ever since this time. A one-time president of the Internet Society, some of you may know his name, Anthony Rutkowski, who's, well, I'll just go ahead with it. Anthony Rutkowski aptly summed up the process, writing that data communications, quote, developed in a kind of golden nest. Special policies were crafted that not only insulated this entire sector from virtually every kind of public process or control, but also provided it with substantial public benefits. There's a quote from someone who was an insider, first at the Federal Communications Commission and then at the Internet Society, to the unfolding process. It wasn't a straight line trend, and there was no master blueprint. As the world's largest single largest national market, though, the US political commitment to network liberalization and the profit projects that rested on it radiated out powerfully. During the 1980s and early 1990s, some of you may remember, the US Trade Representative pushed Brazil to relax its import substitution policies for what it used to call informatics. In using newly augmented powers to do that. The US State and Commerce Departments battled against European initiatives to monitor and restrict corporate transborder data flows, an issue that's come back under more recent conditions. On another front, under Reagan and Thatcher, the US and Britain together mounted a successful attack on the non-aligned movement's drive for what they called a new international information order. Some of you may remember this, which had tried to insist that economic redistribution, rather than profit maximization, should drive policy. Stringent intellectual property laws to suppress some of the radical potential of networks, as Brian Winston might put it. Some of you might know his name. He has what he calls, using sort of mechanistic terminology of the 19th century with respect to media, the law of the suppression of radical potential. And I'm citing that in this. That became still another key objective of economic diplomacy. Coalitions of business users, tech vendors, multilateral agencies, and the executive branch pressed to institutionalize policies to widen the scope of digital profit projects worldwide. And their achievement was breathtaking. Between 1988, when Chile privatized its incumbent telecommunications operator, and 2005, more than 80 less developed countries underwent network privatization. It's hard to imagine a larger movement of infrastructural change in world business history than that. Additional market opening policies became enshrined via the International Telecommunication Union in 1988 and through a 1997 World Trade Organization treaty called the Basic Telecommunications Agreement. There were significant national variations, but political priority was accorded to business users and independent equipment suppliers everywhere. Foreign investment policies, interconnection rules, and policies governing use of networks all were relaxed. Why am I making a point of this? I'm making a point of it because it was on this foundation that the internet was erected. This is what the internet is as a historical product of policy change, or of, I'm mindful that there's a distinction between policy and politics, of a different political consensus. And then the internet altered the center of gravity of networking. Monopoly national telecom systems operated by government ministries were supplanted, or at least overlaid, by decentralized autonomous systems, and they're called in the internet nomenclature autonomous system numbers. That's the way you identify a cooperating, coordinated internet network, an interoperating internet network. And these were operated and interconnected by transnational companies. At the same time, flouting the expectations of most leftists, network access began to expand beyond all precedent, far beyond the wealthy countries. Foreign direct investment flowing into the less developed countries' telecommunications systems increased tenfold during the decade after 1990, which one might say, if you brought it back to the debate over the new international information order, only confirmed the demands of advocates of a new international information order that were there only to be political will, it was possible almost overnight to wire the world. It finally happened. Though ravaging disparities did not disappear, I'm in touch with one of my doctoral students who's in Tanzania at the moment, and he's telling me about some of the conditions when you go even a little bit outside of Dar es Salaam for access in that country, and I know it's not a unique situation. So disparities, of course, remain, but nevertheless, networks drew more investment in poor world countries. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars than any other industry. And this expansion has continued as greenfield projects replaced privatizations as the major growth nexus. This spectacular enlargement of network access may have helped blunt awareness that the internet in fact does possess a political economic control structure. So everybody is so gleeful that after a century of inadequate access, desperately inadequate access, that somehow is enough to make up for the fact that there is still a political economic control structure, or even just to turn a blind eye to it. So we tend, even now, not to credit it. During its formative years, the internet had been managed by the US Department of Defense. Throughout the 80s and 90s, this arrangement underwent a series of transitions, and these still have been little studied using any kind of primary sources. I mean, there's a lot to be done. Universities became widely involved in internet access for a time, but as a larger commercial market began to materialize, by around the late 1980s, 1990, corporate providers began to crowd universities out of internet access on a fairly significant scale. During the 90s, US authorities moved to institutionalize management of the internet by a nonprofit California corporation called ICANN, which I'm sure most of you know, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which was vested with responsibility for the internet system of unique identifiers and participated in its technical development. VeriSign, a shadowy corporation headquartered in spookish Virginia, was accorded a crucial operational role while ICANN was legally bound to report to the US Commerce Department. In practice, these arrangements conferred power on high-tech companies and corporate trademark owners and on the US executive branch. They are notable for downgrading the jurisdiction, or I might say the democratic remit, of the US Federal Communications Commission, which ostensibly regulates civilian telecommunications. It has nothing to do with the internet except to chortle that it's allowed it to emerge by not doing anything. Its role has been really insignificant. And they signify that US negotiators had managed to get the international community, by and large, to acquiesce to a US-centric extraterritorial internet. From the outset, there was disagreement, but the US prevailed. This, after all, was the unipolar moment that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restoration of capitalism in China. Some of us will remember it. An unabashed triumphalism set in. Hailed for disrupting industries, the internet's overriding function was to extend and enlarge capitalism. Even the puncturing of the internet bubble between 1999 and 2001 did not curtail enthusiasm about this rejuvenating prospect. And now I have about almost 3 pages left. Are you up for it? Yeah. Okay, I'd like to be able to finish, but I'm aware that it's been a long day. It's turned out that neither the capitalist political economy nor the internet that now operated as one of its leading growth poles was stable. The global economic slump that commenced in 2007-2008 and the rising geopolitical economic conflicts that have accompanied it instead ushered in a period of open-ended uncertainty. And I think we are in that period. Overcapacity and low investment, high unemployment and high indebtedness now have been coupled to a gathering deflationary impulse. 8 years on, we remain mired in stagnation. And I have given to that process the term digital depression in a book that I wrote fairly recently for that reason, in part. It is likely that deep structural changes will be needed for any true upswing to occur. I've called this condition a digital depression because networks were embedded ubiquitously in the political economy that generated the slump, and because resolution of the downturn is likely to depend on network systems to kickstart the profit projects that will be required to develop further sources of growth on a meaningful scale. Statistics compiled by the US Census Bureau provide a benchmark. In 2007, on the verge of the financial crisis, US capital expenditures on information processing equipment and software overall, so not talking about sectoral variation, but as a gross figure, were about $264 billion. In 2013, they came to $331 billion. This is a nominal increase of around 25%, spread over an interval in which inflation increased by about 15%. Even amid the worst slump since the 1930s, I would argue the dynamism of information investment as a focus of business spending is unmistakable. Global submarine network construction reflects this. The 65 terabits per second of new capacity added worldwide in 2014 equates to almost the entire amount of bandwidth in service in 2011. The costs of internet transit have continued to drop over the last 4 years, 2012 to 2015, by a global average of 14% annually. So these are measures of something much more robust than what much of the rest of the political economy is experiencing. As I've underlined, the scale and scope of digitization renders it of actual or prospective significance for virtually every industry. The largest sectoral contributor to ICT investment is the information industry, which is using it to lead a recomposition of the greater political economy. the seemingly boundless elasticity of digital system applications enables them to participate in innumerable commodification projects. Now, a commodification project sounds like something nasty and evil, and that's okay, I sort of feel that way. But it's also important to understand that that's what's needed to kickstart the political economy from slump. So what you think of it is up to you. I mean, that's not for me to say. Omnipresent commercialization of human interaction via search engines, social networks, e-commerce, and smartphones is perhaps the most visible expression of this wider trend. And we heard quite a bit about this, and justifiably so, in our conference deliberations. But huge R&D spending and back-end investments in data centers, internet exchange facilities, and in the case of content providers such as Google, transoceanic and metropolitan fiber optic networks typically grant to the big purveyors of consumer internet services an impressive capacity for diversification. Amazon has seized the lead in marketing specialized cloud computing services to industrial and governmental users. Facebook is rolling out a private variant of its service called Facebook at Work to challenge enterprise software companies by trying to win revenues from corporate subscriptions rather than only advertising. Professional services like accounting are being beset by digital interlopers. Outsiders' network systems and applications are threatening the turf of banks and other financial intermediaries, another point that we discussed at the meeting today. Driverless or software-intensive cars from Google and Apple are forcing the world's automakers onto defense. I mean, Volkswagen, I can only wonder how horrific it must seem to that good-looking guy from Porsche who's now running the company, because I mean, he's got to deal with not only the crisis, or I should say the what was the scandal of this emissions rigging, but also he's got to deal with a bigger structural threat, which is that he's got companies that are going to eat his lunch. And they don't want to be put in the position of becoming the outsourcers to Google. And that's how they see it, the world's auto industry, or to Apple. Sensors, IP addresses, technical standards to enable machine-to-machine interoperability are helping the information industry to scale the walls of existing industries of other kinds as they attempt to synthesize what such titans of that earlier structure as General Electric, IBM, Cisco, and other companies call the industrial internet. Sometimes it's called the Internet of Things, but the industrial internet. So-called smart cities and online education constitute still other vectors of commodification. We're nowhere near the end of the line. Digital capitalism remains a work in progress. The sort of big question here is whether, as commodification initiatives encroach on new and existing areas of practice, and move into domains that previously were free of commodification, or relatively so, like education or museums or even government services. Whether, as this occurs, there will be sufficient momentum generated to kickstart the overall political economy. And I don't think there's any way to foretell that, because I think this, in the deepest sense, is going to depend on politics. Not policy, but politics. It's going to depend on people's willingness to say economic growth is so significant that we will worship at its shrine instead of anything else. And I hope that they don't do that. I mean, just to be clear on my own views, I would be aghast to see that, but I do think it's the big political choice that this crisis, which I would say is a crisis, continues to throw at us. And we need to add one other point to this, which in a way is implicit in what I've already told you. Companies, the US companies, are in the forefront of this global movement. There's no question of that. But it should not be reduced to a US power projection, because the still rapidly expanding scope of digitization has reached a point that market opportunities are rife. I mean, there are many, and many of them are smaller, and some of them are bigger, and some of them we don't have any idea what they are. But they are rife, and so companies based all over the world, and not even companies, but dreams of people with capital to get into things are proliferating. And we see this presented in the most favorable sorts of ways in the press, as if this is the thing we should all get in on, as if it's ever been demonstrated by capitalism that we all will. That is simply not on. It's not going to happen. I mean, there may be a different set to some extent, but that there will be not only disparities, but forms of exploitation. And even beyond that, issues that are potentially calamitous of an environmental character, issues that not only Naomi Klein, but also Paul Mason has recently flagged in their books. These are the questions that need to be addressed. By one estimate earlier this year, and it's significant that it's earlier this year for reasons that will become evident, 6 of the 20 most valuable internet companies are based in China. That's relevant that it's early this year because this is before the stock market crash in China. So I'm not certain that you would still find that to be true. This is only 6 months ago. But it's also true that the world's most valuable carrier, China Mobile, and a globally ascendant equipment vendor, Huawei, are Chinese companies. And they are doing something seemingly more successfully than European units of capital have managed to do for 50 years, which is to break in on the US information industry. They're using the Chinese market as the key carrot in doing this. And so I would argue that the people who see the issue, the division, shall we say, that separates the US and China only in political terms, they're a bunch of evil authoritarians and we're the good guys. I don't like them any more than the next person for their political system. But it's not just about that. It's about who gets access to the Chinese market. Because the other pole of growth besides the internet is China, has been China. Now China's slowing down. But slowing down in China leaves them with a growth rate double of what we've got. So it still looks like something that needs to be thought about. And that's really an important issue. I'll come to it in a minute. But it's propelling geopolitical economic struggles across a lengthening front. Which companies headquartered in which countries will appropriate the fruits of the digitization process? Who will capture the new sites of profit? Earlier this year, the Financial Times put it well. Quote, talk of protectionism once meant bemoaning barriers being erected in far-off lands for offcuts of beef or steel rods. But in Washington these days, the protectionism fears have gone digital, unquote. And I think that's a very nice way to put it. US President Obama has offered strong support to US capital's digital expansionism. Attacking the European Union's antitrust inquiries, which are ongoing now, Obama declared earlier this year, quote, I'm not sure if this quote has traveled here, and if it has, tell me. Obama said, for the record, we have owned the internet. Our companies have created it, expanded it, perfected it. European companies who can't compete with ours are essentially trying to set up some roadblocks. That's pretty strong language for a president to use. It's really pretty strong language. And the EU then hit back. And I think that's the interesting fact, because there was a time when that would have been harder to do. And so I'm trying to make the point that the growing friction is part of the syndrome that we now find ourselves in. Antitrust investigations and a potentially encompassing digital platforms inquiry might make greater room for European units of capital in their home market. In public, of course, the Europeans deny that any redesign of their regulatory framework will discriminate against US providers. But who's going to say, yeah, it's going to discriminate against US providers? That's not on. You can't really say something like that. German interests in particular, both media companies such as Springer and big manufacturers and engineering companies such as Bosch have become quite pushy in this area. And the reason is because they know it's not just about a limited set of industries, it's about the whole political economy. So Google, Facebook, and the rest have bulked up their lobbying teams in Brussels. And it may not be enough. We'll see. Geopolitical economic fights over digitization are proliferating beyond Europe. A year or two ago, Brazil and India briefly lent support to a wider demand to reorganize the US-centric internet's control structure. This crucial issue is still simmering, though both Brazil and India appear to have bailed on their opposition. Google is now being accused of abusing its dominance in online search by India's Competition Commission in the Indian market. Russian antitrust authorities have ruled that Google broke that country's competition rules. The most open-ended and potentially severe conflict pits the US against a country that has also become a primary economic partner, China. An influential segment of elite US opinion about China has recently begun to harden. Economic issues pertaining to the tech industry are high on the list of concerns. US officials have repeatedly charged that China's domestic regulations for networks and ICTs are about protectionism and favoring Chinese companies. That's a quote from the US Trade Representative earlier this year. The US is alarmed not only because of the very limited reach of big US internet companies in China, Apple and Microsoft are perhaps the most high-profile exceptions, but also because recent Chinese policies continue to aim, as they see it, quote, keeping US businesses out. On a related front, the US is trying to combat China's continuing effort to pull internet management out of its US orbit. Quote, the overall accountability mechanism, a Chinese internet agency charged directly before the US Department of Commerce. So this is a quote from a Chinese internet regulator that has actually gone and filed comments at the US Department of Commerce. Just this month, it says these should not be subject only to the US legal system, but should resolve all issues under the international legal system accepted by all parties. And the use of the word international in that formulation, though it seems innocuous, is significant because it means they're talking about states rather than the multi-stakeholder forum that the US prefers to be the oversight body. By no means does the international community merely line up behind the United States, especially after Edward Snowden's disclosures eroded much of the moral high ground that the US has historically taken. It's difficult from the point of view of much of the world to see the US as qualitatively different from China, to put it in its harshest possible way, with respect to human rights after the Snowden disclosures. And it has a direct economic significance, I'm arguing. US-China conflict over digitization was evident in the state visit to the United States last week by President Xi Jinping, a visit that contrasted sharply with those of Xi's three predecessors. In the run-up to his arrival, President Obama publicly declared to the Business Roundtable, the top business lobby, that his administration is preparing tough measures to counter Chinese cyber espionage, corporate cyber espionage. The U.S.'s primary economic policy question for China cuts, however, toward improved market access for U.S. companies. As former U.S. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson phrased it recently, quote, is China looking to open things up just for the private sector in China, or is it for multinationals as well, unquote. And that cuts to the nub of it. U.S. internet companies in particular want to participate more extensively in China's huge and still rapidly growing digital markets. China has built up a substantial domestic internet industry of its own, and to the consternation of U.S. officials, President Xi began his visit to the United States by organizing a technology forum in Seattle to demonstrate what the New York Times called China's, quote, sway over the American tech industry. So unlike his previous presidents, all of who had gone to pay homage, Xi said, come to me. And they all lined up behind him for the photo op. So you get a sense of the significance and the changing balance that's occurring. US political leaders are plainly pushing as forcefully as ever to assert US capital's economic interests in cyberspace. There is no guarantee that they will succeed, although at the moment odds are that it looks like they've got a good likelihood. But I'd like to conclude by saying that the record shows that capitalism has already undergone, beyond depressions, financial panics and disjunctive moments of great depth, shocking kinds of depth. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not unique to a digital era. Quote, "The machine was not an impersonal achievement to those living through the Industrial Revolution," writes historian Maxine Berg. Quote, "It was an issue. The machinery question in early 19th century Britain was the question of the sources of technical progress and the impact of the introduction of the new technology of the period on the total economy and society." And that's a beautiful statement, captures what I think we need to know. Massive discontinuities and episodes of precipitous crisis, and in many, many tens of thousands of families, calamity, have been features of capitalism from the beginning. Digital capitalism promises to fall within this longer historical arc. And on that very cheery note, I conclude. So,
Dan, thank you very much. I think if you were to look at the history of the network, you could divide it into two tranches of, say, 20 years. For the first period, from 73 to 93, cyberspace was a very strange and unusual place. It had no corporations. It was populated by people who, broadly speaking, knew one another, and it had no spam and no malware, broadly speaking, and all the rest of it. So you could say that in that period we had it was an era of parallel universes. On the one hand, there was cyberspace, which is very special, and then there was what John Perry Barlow calls meat space, which was where the rest of us lived and where governments existed and where there was crime and all kinds of nasty stuff. And then from 93, once the web made the internet into something mainstream, then a different process happened. And what happened, in fact, I think, was that the two universes imperceptibly began to merge to create the world we have now, which is a blend of the two. And the problem with your kind of super realistic picture is that I'm afraid it might be right. So just want to thank you very much for coming. Thank you for the lecture. And to say that we hope you come again. Thank you very much.